In the shadowy heart of Winter Valley where ancient magic whispers through the pines and werewolves roam under the glow of the full moon, Moonlit Redemption, the curse of the Silver Lake Pack, weaves a tale of love, legacy, and the unbreakable bonds that tie the curse to the saviors. Sophia, an unsuspecting outsider, stumbles into a world she never knew existed when she inherits a lakeside cabin from a distant relative. Little does she know, her arrival triggers a series of events that will challenge everything she believes about herself and the world. Drawn into the enigmatic life of Warren, a werewolf grappling with a centuries-old curse bestowed upon him by his own family line, Sophia becomes entangled in a mystery that threatens not only her life but also the fragile peace between humans and werewolves. As their fates intertwine, Sophia discovers her lineage is tied to the very curse that plagues Warren. Together, they embark on a journey to uncover the secrets of the Silver Lake Pack and the ancient ritual that could break the curse. Along the way, they must confront their deepest fears, navigate treacherous rivalries, and decipher cryptic messages left by Sophia's ancestors. Moonlit Redemption explores the power of love and the price of redemption in a world where darkness looms, and the moon holds the key to unlocking ancient powers. The novel is a heart-stopping adventure that blurs the lines between enemies and allies, revealing that sometimes the greatest curse can become the source of one's ultimate salvation. With its blend of romance, suspense, and supernatural intrigue, this novel offers a fresh take on the werewolf genre, delving into themes of identity, sacrifice, and the unyielding strength of the human spirit. Moonlit Redemption, The Curse of the Silver Lake Pack, is a tale that will captivate readers, whisking them away on a journey under the shimmering moonlight, where love and redemption await in the most unexpected of places. Chapter 1. Off the leash. Colin was excited. It was impossible not to be. He could smell the rain falling from the sky and hear every droplet as it bounced off the asphalt. He could feel the pressure shift in the air as the weather system swirled above them and blew through the dark alleyway where Colin crouched next to Silas. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" said Silas. Concern was painted across the older man's face. "How many times are you going to ask me that?" said Colin. "At least 3 more times." "I'm fine, Silas. I really am." And he was more than fine. He was out of Elkwood for the first time in over 2 years, for the first time since becoming a werewolf. His senses soared, and his heart raced. "You stink with excitement," said Silas. One of the minor drawbacks of being a werewolf was knowing what other wolves in your pack were feeling, thinking, and doing almost all of the time. That's the kind of relationship Colin shared with Silas ever since the older wolf had bitten Colin, less than 6 months ago. Ironically, the alley where they now crouched was in Seattle, exactly the place Colin was heading to in his grandmother's stolen car when he hit Silas, which in turn resulted in Colin being bitten and turning into a giant supernatural creature, changing his life forever. Colin had been heading to Seattle to speak with his parents, whom he barely ever saw and rarely spoke to. They were probably in the city right now, working late, happily ignoring the fact that Colin even existed. But it didn't bother Colin, not anymore. He had his grandmother. True, she was a blind, angry, old, all-powerful witch, but she had come to accept her only grandson and his inner werewolf. He also had Silas, a several centuries-old werewolf, who out of sheer panic had bitten Colin, creating an unbreakable bond. And then there was Becca. "Get your head in the game, Colin," said Silas. "Right, sorry. Mind wanders." "I know. I can hear every thought in your head." "That works both ways." "You sing in your head a lot," said Colin with a smile. "I do not." "You do. You've got a real Elvis obsession." Silas turned and glared at Colin with those dark yellowish eyes and said, "He was the king of rock and roll." Okay. No one's arguing that with you. I'm sure he was great. I saw him in concert. He was amazing." Communicating by thought was another werewolf skill that Colin both loved and hated. It was a great way to talk, but it was next to impossible to shut off. Silas and Colin's in-ear microphones crackled to life and a male voice said, "Beta 7 to Wolfman." "This is Wolfman," Silas answered, whispering to Colin. "I hate that name." "Better than Wolfpup," said Colin. "We've got eyes on the target," said Beta 7. "Where is he?" growled Silas. "He's heading north. Should be passing by you in a few minutes, over." The rain was getting heavier. Water dripped from Silas's shaggy hair as he shifted to get a better look at the alleyway opening 100 feet away. Not long after becoming a werewolf, Colin ate his murderous biology teacher. and save the town of Elkwood thanks in part to Silas's guidance. Elkwood's governing body agreed to allow them both to stay as long as they agreed to join a new group that was being formed to help combat rogue supernatural people and creatures. Night Watch was created to track down and neutralize threats and also to bring more special people into the safety of Elkwood. After many early morning and late night training sessions, Silas had decided Colin was ready to venture into the field, which was why they were both crouched in a dark alley late at night, waiting for a potentially dangerous man to walk by. "Do you remember the plan?" said Silas. "You're going to question him," said Colin. "And if he attacks? We defend but try not to harm him too much. This is one of the only leads we've managed to track down that could potentially take us to the group of murderous werewolves we're searching for. They're causing more and more trouble and we're no closer to catching them." "Didn't you track werewolves for years?" "Yes," said Silas. "So you can imagine how much it bothers me that I can't even get a whiff of these guys." Colin knew that part of Silas's reason for signing up for Night Watch was to have access to resources that would help him track the rogue werewolves that stepped out of line and threatened to expose our kind. It's what Silas had been doing for centuries, protecting the bloodlines, keeping us a secret. This particular group was the same group that turned Mr. Winter, but they'd proved to be next to impossible to catch, and Colin knew, thanks to their psychic link, that it was driving Silas crazy. "What happens if he runs?" said Silas. "We let him run and let the beta team track him," said Colin, reciting the correct answers. He knew they were correct because they'd been over the rules what felt like 100 times. "We do not chase him," said Silas, fixing his eyes on Colin. "We do not chase him," agreed Colin. "Good. Now let your senses go. Tell me what you feel." "I feel uncomfortable," said Colin, tugging at the neckline of his tactical uniform. It was all black and reinforced with Kevlar, though they didn't really need the extra protection, and it kept pinching them in awkward places. Apparently it was supposed to expand with their bodies if they changed into werewolves, but they hadn't had a chance to test it out yet. "I'm serious," said Silas in that tone of voice that indicated he was indeed serious. Colin took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and let his senses wander. Just like Silas had taught him, the city sprang to life around him. He breathed deeply through his nose and let the sounds from all over the surrounding areas flow to him. The alley sprang to life in vivid colors as smells washed around. Colin could see old garbage, motor oil, and a very adventurous rat. "What can you sense?" said Silas. "The alley. Push farther. Listen harder. Don't inhale so much, you'll give yourself a headache. Just grab the random smells from the air and let your brain piece them together." This would be easier in werewolf form. And it was. All of Colin's werewolf abilities were so much stronger when he transformed into the 8-foot hairy beast that was constantly clawing to get out. "Not here," said Silas. "Too many people." Colin listened beyond the alley, and the city sounds began to get louder. Cars driving through puddles, footsteps, people talking, tapping out texts on their cell phones, dinner cooking. There were so many different food smells. Colin started to drool a little. "Block out the food. It'll distract you." "No food." "Got it." They'd had a big meal before they left Elkwood. Silas had made Colin eat a couple of extra steaks. The urge to eat was strong for a werewolf, and although Colin never felt the compulsion to eat anyone, he certainly felt hungry all the time. A set of footsteps stood out from the rest of the sounds. They were heavy and they were moving toward the alley. They would hurry and then slow, hurry then slow. "That's our guy." "How do you know?" "He's walking fast but keeps slowing down to check behind him. He smells like raw meat." "Why does he smell like that?" "He's a butcher." Colin understood almost immediately. They were hunting a pack of werewolves. They would need to eat. And while Silas had found stray reports of them killing innocent people, they'd still need to eat more. A lot more. This man was their meat supplier. The footsteps sped up as the butcher entered the alley. Colin opened his eyes to see Silas crouching low behind the dumpster. "Stay here. Listen, watch, learn." But Silas leapt over the dumpster in a single bound. The butcher shrieked as the large man with scraggly hair landed in front of him and stood to his full height. Silas grabbed the terrified man by his jacket and lifted him off the ground. Colin could see members of their backup squad beta team on a nearby rooftop. Having a couple of werewolves as living weapons was a good thing for Night Watch, but that didn't mean they were allowed off the leash without a few handlers nearby. Do you know who I am? Growled Silas. I don't know anything. I don't, shouted the man in panic. I'm just a wholesale meat vendor. I don't know anything. I really don't know who you are. He was lying. Colin could hear the subtle changes in the man's heartbeat. Silas threw the butcher against a dumpster on the opposite side of the alleyway and then picked him up again. Don't make me ask twice, he growled. You're the one who hunts. Well, you hunt them, stammered the butcher. And you feed them. I need to know where they are. Silas dropped him back on his feet. And if you do that for me, I'll let you go about your business and forget that you've been feeding a group of murderous creatures. They'll kill me, said the butcher. I'll do worse, said Silas. Colin sniffed the air. There was something off about the whole thing. Something about the man didn't smell right. Colin could smell the man's fear. But it had changed slightly. There was something else there, a distinct floral smell. Colin had made a catalog of what different emotions smelled like, but they were all so subtle it was hard to pinpoint them sometimes. But he knew. This one. It was on the tip of his brain. Not excitement, not worry, not panic. Anticipation. Silas, he's going to do something. The butcher's hand swept under his rain jacket and Colin caught the glint of light on metal. Knife. Silas moved backwards as the man swung the knife clumsily. It caught Silas's left forearm and Colin could immediately smell the blood. A rage boiled up inside of him. This man attacked his mentor, his packmate. The wolf inside growled and Colin could feel his control over the creature slipping. He placed both hands on the dumpster and pushed with all his considerable strength. The large metal cube flew from its spot and caught the man in the shoulder, knocking him to the ground. The knife skittered across the wet asphalt. The butcher scrambled to his feet and took off down the alley. Silas, shouted Colin. That was a silver knife, said Silas, covering the wound with his other hand. To slow the bleeding. He was expecting us. Colin could hear the radio chatter of the rest of the night watch squad, but he ignored it. His heart raced and all he could see through a shade of red was the retreating figure of the man who had attacked and hurt Silas. No, Colin. Don't. Colin leapt over Silas and took off at a run. Colin! Silas shouted, but the thundering of the butcher's heart drowned out all else. It was late, so traffic was light as Colin burst out into the city street, but there were still people hanging around the concrete jungle. They gave Colin odd looks, likely wondering why some kid was dressed in tactical gear and running through dark streets in the rain. His bright amber eyes probably didn't help Colin look any more normal. The butcher was running down the street, weaving through oncoming traffic. Colin raced after him. The cars kicked up sprays of water, soaking Colin in his pursuit, but he didn't care. He knew how fast he could run, and he'd be on the man in no time. A taxi swerved to try and beat a stoplight and skidded out of control on the wet pavement. Colin sprang into the air, clearing the taxi and landing on a minivan. He jumped again, clearing 2 more vehicles, and slid across the roof of a transport truck and off the edge and landed in a run. He was 10 feet from his victim and he could smell the fear floating off the butcher. No, screamed the man. They'll kill me if I tell you anything. I'll do worse. Colin, you have to stop. I've almost got him. Let him go. I'm so close. We don't know who else might be working with H. All sounds stopped. All smells vanished. Colin stumbled and felt blind for a moment. It was like his senses had been turned off completely. Cars whizzed by, and the butcher disappeared down a side street. Lightning cracked across the sky, throwing long shadows across the rain-soaked street. The glare of oncoming headlights blinded Colin, and for a split second he looked to the sky to shield his eyes. Far above him, floating 100 feet in the air, was a man. Colin's wolf eyes cut through the darkness and he could clearly make out the figure. He was youngish, late 20s maybe, with long hair, and he was sitting cross-legged, floating in the air. He was dressed in a suit with a black cloak that billowed out behind him. A thick chain hung around his neck, dangling what looked like a bright red rock. The man's eyes glowed an ominous deep red, matching the color of the rock. He was staring directly at Colin. Who are you? Colin shouted, but he couldn't even hear his own voice. The floating man smiled and then vanished, as if he'd never been there. Colin's heightened senses returned all at once, and it felt as if someone had set him on fire. Everything hit him at the same time and he thought his head would split in half. The sound of car horns, tires screeching, people shouting, TVs blaring, the buzz of the streetlights. Smells wafted over him. So fast that the world became a wash of colors in Colin's brain that made his head swim. Colin felt the creature inside him stir uncomfortably while his heart tried to beat out of his chest. He'd felt this sensation before. The first time he'd ever experienced a change, it was uncontrollable. No, Silas. I'm changing. Colin. What happened? You have to get off the street. Colin's muscles contorted and stretched. A woman in a nearby car screamed. I can't stop it. Concentrate, Colin. Try to stay calm. It's too late. The change tore through him like it had so many times before. All of Colin's body expanded at once, his face elongating as sharp teeth began to line his mouth. His ears moved to the top of his head and hair exploded all over him. His hands curled, a razor-sharp claw tipping each large hairy finger. Traffic had come to a standstill and camera phones were beginning to pop up. Colin's tactical suit had expanded with his body, so at least he wasn't a naked werewolf standing on a busy Seattle street. However, he was still a giant werewolf, and that kind of thing attracts attention. Colin crouched and leapt high into the sky and caught a window ledge on the nearest building. He leapt higher and higher up the building, reaching the roof in a few bounds. He peered back over the edge and saw people had gotten out of their cars and were looking up for the creature they just encountered. A small metal device bounced off a few cars and there followed a small flash. The car engines all died at once and the streetlights went out along with the power to the surrounding buildings, for a full city block. That was an EMP, an electromagnetic pulse. We just killed the local power grid. Beta team will fry all the devices in the area next. Cell phones and such. Are you okay? I'm sorry, Silas. His senses back under control, Colin concentrated on being human again and felt the wolf retreat back inside his body. He shrank down to his normal size. His muscles returned to their usual state, and the hair shed from his body and vanished. A helicopter swooped overhead and came to rest on the rooftop where Colin crouched human once again. The door slid open and Silas, his arm bandaged, waved him over. The chopper ride back to Elkwood was a quiet one. The members of Beta Team that hadn't stayed behind to clean up Colin's mess smelled angry and frustrated. Silas looked out the window. Silas, I'm sorry. The old wolf held up a hand. It's okay. I thought you were ready. You're not. I almost had him. You almost ended up on the 11 o'clock news. It wasn't my fault. The floating man shut off my wolf sense and give me a break, kid. You and I share thoughts. I don't see a floating man in there. You screwed up, it's okay to admit it. Colin felt frustration growing. But I didn't. He was there. The change wasn't my fault. Silas placed a hand on Colin's shoulder and he gave a tired smile. I forget how young you are sometimes. You've come such a long way so fast. But you're still just a puppy. I'm afraid I'm going to have to ground you for a while. Oh, come on, please, pleaded Colin. Sorry, kid. You're grounded to Elkwood until further notice. Chapter 2. In the doghouse. The helicopter descended through the dense clouds that hung over Elkwood and touched down with a thump in the works yard of the old army base located on the high ridge on the outskirts of town. After joining Night Watch, one of the soldiers had informed Colin of the history of the base, that it had been built during the Second World War as a coastal outpost during a time when the U.S. was overly paranoid about attacks from the west. The base was abandoned almost as soon as it was built. Once Elkwood became a haven for people with particular gifts, the government took over the base to use as their headquarters. Colin's girlfriend's father, Mr. Emerson, was stationed here as the leader of the Night Watch program, along with the new commander over Elkwood, Elric Varsun. Varsun was a tall, fidgety man who was quickly balding and always struck Colin as being exceptionally nervous, which was exactly the way he looked when Colin slid open the chopper door and stepped out. Varsun and Mr. Emerson stood by the entrance to the base. Varsun looked twitchy and his tie was askew. Mr. Emerson smelled angry, but Colin didn't need any sort of werewolf sense to make that deduction. He could see it in the man's face. Great. Another reason for Mr. Emerson to hate me. During Colin's first transformation into a werewolf, he had punched Mr. Emerson and knocked him out cold. It wasn't the best first impression, and Mr. Emerson was less than pleased that his daughter, Becca, was dating a werewolf. "Hi, Varson," said Colin as he and Silas approached. "Mr. Emerson. Enjoyed our trip to Seattle, did we?" said Mr. Emerson, sarcasm dripping from his voice. "It was nice," said Colin. "Very friendly people. I wish we'd had more time to do some sightseeing. Inside now," Mr. Emerson growled. Silas gave Colin a sad sort of look. "He's going to shout at me, isn't he? For at least half an hour, I'm guessing. I don't know, that vein on his forehead is throbbing. I'm going to bet he shouts for a full 45 minutes. Colin, I know. This is serious." The door to the base began to open and a scent Colin didn't recognize wafted through. Colin knew all the scents in Elkwood. He could recognize everyone by the way they smelled, but this was someone new. The door opened fully and a kind-looking old man shuffled out. He leaned heavily on a walking stick and was dressed in a tweed suit. Thick glasses rested on a large nose set above a bushy mustache. He was escorted by two of the base guards. The old man grinned at Colin and shuffled off to the helicopter where the guards helped him in. "You coming?" asked Silas. "Who was that guy?" "The old guy? No idea. I've never seen him before here. You have bigger things to worry about." Colin and Silas followed behind Varson and Mr. Emerson as they entered the large cargo elevator and descended to one of the many subterranean floors of the base. While it may have looked like a single building base on the surface, there were a number of floors beneath the ground that housed everything from holding cells and offices to barracks and research labs. One floor existed in a completely different dimension, where a demon named Charles lived. The doors swished open and Colin recognized the floor as the same one he and Silas had been taken to after the incident when Colin ate his biology teacher. They were led into a small gray room and asked to take a seat. "Here it comes." "Just what on earth did you think you were doing?" Mr. Emerson shouted. "And there it is. Do you realize the danger you placed the team in?" Mr. Emerson said, not waiting for an answer. "What it would have meant for Elkwood and everyone who lives here if we were discovered. We take very precise steps to hide you and the other residents from the outside world, and what do you do the first time you step foot outside of Elkwood? You go on a rampage on a busy city street." Mr. Emerson had begun pacing while Varson sat and awkwardly played with his tie. "What's the fallout?" asked Silas. "Beta team contained the area. The EMP they dispatched knocked out all the power for a square block and everyone in the immediate area has been detained," Mr. Emerson added. "We've had to dispatch Alfred to magic their memories away." "Is that who the old man was?" said Colin. "That's right," he nodded. "He lives in a cottage up north, much like your grandmother. He's an integral part of this community. He keeps our normal residents believing there's nothing unusual about Elkwood." "Is he a wizard or something?" "That's not what we're here to talk about," Mr. Emerson shouted, the vein in his head throbbing again. Colin could hear his heartbeat thumping a mile a minute. Colin filed Alfred the wizard away. He would ask Becca about him later. The last thing he wanted was for Mr. Emerson's head to explode. "Alfred will cast a spell over the detained residents of Seattle," Varson said, while tugging on his tie. "They'll believe they were caught in an electrical blackout and none of them will have any memory of a young boy turning into a giant werewolf in the middle of their city." "Sounds like all's well that ends well," said Colin, repeating something he'd heard his grandmother say once or twice. Mr. Emerson stopped pacing and slammed the palms of his hands down on the table with a bang. Colin had never seen him this upset. "All is not well," he yelled. "You lost control in the middle of an operation." "He hurt Silas," said Colin. Mr. Emerson turned to Silas. "And you assured me he was ready, that he was prepared, that he could handle being out in the field. Not only did you lose the man we were tracking, but your young protege almost destroyed the night watch operation before it even had a chance to get started." Colin could feel the anger bubbling in Silas, could feel the centuries-old werewolf twitch under the pressure. "I didn't lose control," said Colin. "There was a flying man who blocked my senses." Colin felt the fight go out of Silas. Varson leaned forward with interest. "A flying man, you say? What did he look like? How was he flying?" said Varson. "He was sitting cross-legged, high in the air above me when I was in the street. His eyes glowed red." "And enough," said Mr. Emerson. Silas, did you see any evidence of this flying man? Silas glanced at Colin. I'm sorry. No, said Silas. I didn't see him. Silas, I promise I'm not making this up, said Colin. One moment I'd almost caught the butcher and the next minute I couldn't hear or smell anything. My senses were completely gone. Then all at once they flooded back so much louder and stronger than before. It was him, it was the flying man. Silas turned to Colin and placed a hand on his shoulder. Colin, you understand our connection better than anyone. You know I can see your memories and thoughts the same way you can see mine. I don't see anything like what you're describing. I see you were chasing the butcher and then you lost control and changed. Then it's settled, said Mr. Emerson triumphantly. Colin is grounded to Elkwood until further notice. I'll see if we can track down the butcher again, and hopefully we can salvage some of this operation. Mr. Emerson turned and left the room, slamming the door behind him. Colin could smell the smug satisfaction wafted off him as he left. Well, said Varsun as he straightened his tie and edged his way around the table, I suppose that's it for tonight. You two should get some rest. If I'm not mistaken, Colin, you have school in the morning. Varsun nodded politely and exited. You really don't believe me, said Colin. I want to, said Silas, but I see what you see, and I don't see this flying man. It was the strangest sensation. It was like my senses of smell and hearing were gone. I was cut off from my wolf senses. Silas sighed. I should get you home. The pair drove away from the base, taking the old forest road around the ridge and down into Elkwood. Colin would have preferred to run home, but Silas insisted on making sure he got there safely. Silas's old jeep bounced along the rocky service road. You won't be grounded forever. Emerson will come around. Oh yeah, I'm sure he'll let me off the leash again real soon. Like when I'm 30. He's just concerned for the mission. Silas spun the jeep around a sharp corner and accelerated over a small hill. The town of Elkwood sprang into view through the trees. The dim lights of the small downtown core glowed through the fog, and Colin could make out the blinking neon sign of the gas station. You wanted to bite his head off in there. I felt it. Silas glanced over at Colin. I've been doing this a long time. Centuries. I survived the Old West. I've been stabbed, shot, hung, hit with multiple vehicles, dropped off a cliff, and set on fire more than once. I don't like someone who's 187 years younger than I am talking down to me. Colin smiled. Mr. Emerson should really learn to respect his elders. Yes, he should. I'd hate to have to eat him. Silas laughed at his own joke, and Colin couldn't help but smile. Silas had come a long way from the gruff, angry man he'd been when Colin first encountered him. Now he was a gruff, angry man with a sense of humor and was, thanks to Colin, much more knowledgeable about movies. He'd already watched Gremlins, all 3 Lord of the Rings movies, and was working his way through the latest series of superhero movies. Colin had tried to get him to watch some classic horror movies like The Exorcist and A Nightmare on Elm Street, but Silas laughed too much. Colin had to admit, after having encountered real vampires, witches, and other creatures of the night, seeing them in a movie was actually boring, bordering on funny. Silas raced through the deserted nighttime streets and screeched into the small suburban area where Colin's house was located. Colin's grandmother's house was a small 2-bedroom, 2-floor Victorian-style townhome. His grandmother was technically blind, but, being an all-powerful witch, she got by with very little problem. Colin had never asked her about it, but as far as he could figure, she had some sort of extra sense that allowed her to get around, cook, and take care of herself. Her main power resided in the weather. She represented Elkwood's first line of defense by keeping the weather perpetually grim and overcast, so there was no chance of anyone ever spying on the residents with satellites, drones, or other skybound technology. The bad weather generally discouraged visitors. Occasionally someone new would move to Elkwood, but they quickly fell under the spell that the rest of the normal people were under. The town was the perfect cover for creatures like Colin and Silas. The jeep stopped in front of Colin's house. I'm really sorry, kid. We'll keep training and get you back out there. Don't think I'm not thankful for what you did back there chasing that man. We're a pack. When I get hurt, I know you feel it. Not physically, but in here. Silas tapped his own chest. I appreciate your reasons, but you're going to have to get those kinds of feelings under control. Are you really telling a teenage werewolf to get his feelings under control? I'm nothing but feelings. I'm just a big mess of feelings and hormones. Oh. And let's not forget the giant werewolf lurking around inside me. It's not just a control issue, said Silas. Colin could feel the worry pouring off the older wolf. What is it, Silas? You've been doing so well, I didn't think I'd need to bring it up. Bring what up? Silas sighed and looked Colin directly in the eye. There's a reason most werewolves go bad. They get a taste of this new power and they give themselves over to it. They give the werewolf too much control. The 6 months after the first change is the most dangerous time for a young werewolf. A lot of them can't handle it. You're saying I might go crazy? You think that's what happened tonight? I don't know what happened tonight, and I'm not saying you're going crazy. I'm just warning you. Silas smiled. You're a good kid, Colin. Go get some rest. Try to stay out of trouble. We'll talk more tomorrow. Colin climbed out of the jeep and waved to Silas as he sped away down the road. Pushing open the front door, the smells of home filled his senses. His grandmother had eaten steak for dinner, medium rare with roast potatoes. His stomach rumbled a little. He could also smell the leftovers in the fridge. One drawback to being a werewolf was the overactive metabolism. He needed to eat every few hours to stay full and keep any urges to eat people at bay. Moving down the hallway toward the kitchen, he could hear the rhythmic heartbeat of his grandmother. Is she asleep? Heartbeat is a little fast. She must be dreaming. The clock on the hallway wall showed it to be a little after 1 o'clock. Stepping as lightly as he could into the kitchen, Colin flicked on the light and had a small heart attack. Gran! The little old lady was sitting at the kitchen table in her nightgown with her hair in curlers, a cold cup of coffee in front of her. You scared me half to death, said Colin. His heart was racing so fast he had to breathe deeply to slow it down before he turned into a werewolf and made a mess of the small kitchen. A smile played on the woman's wrinkled face. You're back earlier than I expected. Things not go so well. You already know, said Colin, raising a questioning eyebrow. I know everything. So you heard. I chatted with that demon fellow from the base. Charles, Colin said, taking a seat across from his grandmother. He appeared in my bedroom. No man has been in my bedroom since your grandfather gave me a bit of a start. I almost called down a lightning bolt. Well, he's less man, more terrifying looking demon. I'll take your word for it. You wouldn't have done him any damage. He can only astral project himself into town. He's bound to an alternate dimension or something like that. I'm well aware of his limitations, and that he's a political refugee from hell, but mark my words, he'll get more than a binding if he shows up in my bedroom again. He told me things may not have gone well for you tonight. His grandmother being kind to him still occasionally felt strange to Colin. He had been so used to her being cruel and vicious up until the point he'd become a werewolf that these moments still felt a bit alien. Colin got the sense that, since his transformation, the old lady felt some sort of kinship and a need to protect him. I've been grounded to Elkwood. Colin glanced at the fridge where the leftovers were located. Help yourself. His grandmother took a sip of the cold coffee while Colin grabbed the food. So what happened? Tell me everything. Between mouthfuls, Colin recounted the whole story. Tracking the butcher, Silas getting injured, the street chase, the floating man, no one believing him, not even Silas, his eventual tongue lashing from Mr. Emerson, and Silas telling him about how werewolves can sometimes go crazy. His grandmother sat quietly and listened to everything. Colin heard a slight change in her heart rate when he mentioned the floating man. Glowing red eyes, you say? You're sure? She said. Certain. Colin nodded with a mouthful of steak. Interesting. So you believe me? The old lady shrugged. It's late. You have school tomorrow. With that she got up and shuffled out of the kitchen and up to her bedroom. Well, that was weird. Even for her. Colin finished the rest of the potatoes and helped himself to half a box of cookies and a large glass of milk. Finally satisfied, he headed up to his room. The bookshelf next to his bed was full of dog-eared notepads, all crammed with Colin's notes and observations of his changes and experiences as a werewolf. One book was filled with nothing but descriptions of how different emotions smelled. Another he'd filled, with the help of some biology textbooks from the base, with what was happening to his body when he changed. Some were about his wolf senses. Another was full of doodles of different types of werewolves he sometimes saw in his dreams. Colin reached for a fresh notepad and quickly sketched down what had happened in Seattle, the smells, the sounds, the sensation before he'd changed so suddenly. He also wrote down all he could remember about the floating man in the sky. The cell phone provided to him by Varsun in case of emergencies buzzed on his bedside table and showed 2 missed calls from Becca, as well as a barrage of text messages. Becca. Where are you? Becca, Dad's home. He's unusually happy. Becca, I'm worried. Becca. Overheard Dad. True, you are grounded? Totally not fair. Becca. Are you okay? A surge of warmth rushed through Colin. He'd been dating Becca for around 5 months and he still got that warm fuzzy feeling when she showed she cared. Even in small ways, when it was just a note or a text message. Colin set aside his notepad and tapped away at the phone. Colin, true. Turned into a werewolf in the middle of Seattle. Your dad was furious. Not my fault. Weird floating man made me do it. Or I'm losing my mind. Could go either way. Colin stripped down to his underwear and curled up at the bottom of his bed. He hadn't been able to sleep normally in a bed since he became a werewolf. He found it far more comfortable to sleep curled up at the end of the bed. His cell phone buzzed. Becca? The weird floating man? I want to know more. But it's late. Talk tomorrow. Sleep good, Wolfboy 333. Colin smiled and let the phone slide from his hand as he quickly slipped into a deep sleep. His dreams were wolf dreams, shadows of memories from other werewolves that streamed through his sleeping mind in rapid succession. He had them every night. Sometimes they were the same and sometimes they were different. Colin found them oddly comforting. But tonight something was very different. In each dream there was something new. A man would be standing somewhere in the background. A man wearing a long black cape. A man who smiled knowingly. A man with glowing red. Chapter 3. A matter of principle. The alarm screamed its usual wake-up call, a repetitive mwop 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 sound, and Colin fought the urge to smash it into tiny, annoying pieces. 6:30 a.m. blinked at him as he switched off the alarm. His head felt fuzzy. Not enough sleep. Wolves need sleep. Before the change, Colin could always count on a cold shower to pull him out of his haze, but he'd noted early on that werewolves maintained a higher body temperature than normal, and as a consequence he rarely felt the cold. Colin shaved his face, as he had to do every morning and evening otherwise. He'd have a beard within 24 hours. He also had to have his hair cut once a week. It wasn't a big deal for the other creatures and monsters in town, but for the norms it would probably seem weird. The norms were how everyone referred to the normal people in town, the ones that weren't vampires, zombies, gargoyles, dragons, werewolves, ogres, goblins, half-breeds, or numerous other things. All the norms were magicked to believe everything was normal, but that only went so far. When Colin had eaten his biology teacher, Mr. Winter, 5 months ago in front of the entire school, everyone had seen it. Colin was unconscious for several days afterward. But, as he understood it, the vast majority of the town's norms had to have a spell cast on them to forget the incident. It was important that the freaks, as Becca liked to refer to herself and the others, keep a low profile. It was essential to the secrecy of Elkwood. It was part of their cover. Colin could hear his grandmother was already up and around and could smell breakfast from his room. His mouth watered slightly. He leapt from the top of the stairs to the bottom, landing lightly, and hurried to the kitchen. His grandmother placed a mountainous plate of bacon and scrambled eggs in front of him as he took his seat at the table. Rain hammered against the window. Looks like a beautiful day outside, said Colin. Not my doing, said his grandmother. Sometimes it just rains because it rains. It's okay. It matches my mood. The old lady barked a laugh as she sat down with her own plate of food. Still brooding, are we? Colin shrugged, though his gran couldn't see it. I guess. Not much sleep. Plus being grounded, plus Monday. It all adds up to a pretty rotten mood. Don't forget, you have a new principal starting today. Principal A. Bear had been the chief caretaker over Elkwood School. He wasn't even remotely qualified, but he was built like a linebacker and had the necessary military training required to keep an eye on a school full of special people. All that came to a terrible end when Mr. Winter bit Principal Hebert's head off. Since then the students had been waiting for his replacement with a certain amount of excitement and nervousness. Colin wondered if they'd actually get someone qualified this time or just another military man. Well, that'll be something, I suppose, said Colin, gobbling down another strip of bacon. Oh, don't be all mopey, his grandmother snapped. Sometimes it just rains. Because it rains. You said that already. And it's true. You're down. 5 months ago you were down too. Then, werewolf bit you and everything changed. Sometimes the outlook is bright. Sometimes it's dull. And sometimes it just rains because it rains and there's nothing you did to make it happen and nothing you can do to make it different. Colin's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. This was the closest thing to a pep talk or any sort of encouragement his grandmother had ever given him, and what's more, she made perfect sense. You're right. Of course I'm right, she said. I'm almost always right. Colin smiled at the aged witch sitting across from him as she devoured her own plate of food. You're going to be late, she said between mouthfuls. Colin finished off the last few bites, grabbed his lunch from the fridge, pulled on a baggy sweatshirt, and headed for the door. And don't be out too late tonight. Remember, you're grounded and I don't want to have to come looking for you, shouted his grandmother. Yes, Gran, Colin said and slipped out the front door. He hit the sidewalk at a run and headed for the school. The rain had downgraded to a light drizzle by the time Colin reached the front gates of Elkwood School. Becca was standing under an umbrella waiting for him, looking dark and lovely. She wore her usual ensemble: black skinny jeans, black tank top, and a dark brown jacket that accented her fiery red hair. Her skin was pale with no blemishes and just the right amount of freckles, and she wore dark eyeliner that brought out her greenish-gray eyes. Colin was more than familiar with her smell, and it gave him a sense of comfort and warmth in the pit of his stomach that was hard to describe. You're late, said Becca. Jeremy gave up waiting and went inside already. And yet here you are, ever the rebel, Colin said and scooped her up in a hug and spun her around. Well, I'd hate for you to hurt yourself walking across the schoolyard. Becca yawned. Rough sleep last night? No, slept great. I slept so deep I don't remember a thing. Becca and Colin's relationship had been progressing wonderfully, at least from Colin's point of view, and he hoped from hers too. They spent most evenings together and almost every weekend, except the times Mr. Emerson forbid it. Becca's healing skills as the resident necromancer meant she sometimes needed to treat the freaks of Elkwood, including the dangerous ones they kept locked up at the base. Shall we? Said Colin, sweeping his hand toward the gate. I'd hate to miss Monday morning math. Hey, did you hear we're getting a new principal today? Yeah, pretty exciting, replied Becca, her tone dripping with sarcasm. They walked hand in hand through the gates toward the large old stone building. The bell rang out across the yard. I heard a rumor from Jeremy, said Colin, who heard it from Tori, who heard it from her dad, who heard it from one of the soldiers from the base, that the new principal won't be a norm at all. That seems unlikely, said Becca. Why? Asked Colin. Because other than Silas, all the other higher-ups in Elkwood are norms. Seems strange they'd employ someone different to be the principal. It'll probably be some ex-Marine like a bear was. So are you going to tell me about what happened last night? Colin had managed to put the whole thing out of his mind as soon as he laid eyes on Becca, but now it all came flooding back. Sometimes it just rains because it rains. I'll tell you over lunch. Oh, I know that face. That's your I really don't want to talk about it. But if you're going to make me, I will, just not right now face. Colin went to push open the heavy front doors of the school but never had a chance. The door swung open by itself with a swish and Colin fell into the school. Very smooth, said Becca, helping him to his feet. Did that door just open by itself? Colin and Becca moved away from the door and it swung closed. Colin took a step closer and it swished open again. When did we get automatic doors? Said Becca. And why? Added Colin. They proceeded to math class and before they could push open the classroom door it opened for them. Come in, came the shrill voice of Miss Pettigrew, the resident math teacher who seemed to live in a constant state of excitement about her subject. Her enthusiasm confused the students, who mostly hated math. Don't mind the doors, they're new. She ushered them to their seats. Miss Pettigrew was an older lady, her hair in a bun that looked far too tight, and always dressed in a long skirt, button-up shirt and cardigan. Her joy for math aside, Colin didn't mind her at all as she was always nice to the students. Becca and Colin sat down at neighboring desks. Behind Colin, Jeremy leaned over his desk. Morning call. Jeremy. Why do we have automatic doors throughout the school? Rumor is that it's something to do with the new principal. Quiet down now, said Miss Pettigrew. I think you're all going to be pretty excited about today's lesson. Wait for it. That's right. We're doing algebra. There was a collective groan from the class. Colin hated algebra. Counting with numbers was hard enough. Replacing those numbers with letters and expecting them to function the same way just seemed crazy. Colin tried to concentrate on math, he really did, but it wasn't working. He kept replaying the events in Seattle over and over again in his head. Had he really seen the floating man in the sky? Was he going crazy? Was it just another werewolf thing? He could smell all the other students in the classroom and hear almost everyone in the entire building if he tried, though it just sounded like a lot of noise. He tried to focus in on specific conversations, but only picked up snippets here and there. Then my cat coughed up this thing, it looked like a dead rat. That was a 9th grade girl whose name Colin couldn't remember. She seemed nice enough, but was obsessed with her cat. Dirty little ingrates, always leaving a mess wherever they go. Mr. Potts, the school janitor. Lunch money. I want all of it. That was Gareth Dugan, the resident bully, and Colin's former nemesis. Indeed, that's why Romeo loved Juliet. And if they'd had phones in those days, the whole terrible ordeal could have been avoided. Mr. Abernathy, the English teacher. Have to control it. Colin didn't recognize the voice, but it belonged to a kid a little younger than Colin by the sound of it. Mr. Sampson will be arriving after lunch. Had a bit of trouble getting himself together this morning. It sounded to Colin like Varson's voice. Hopefully his unique situation won't cause any trouble at the school. Yet, yes, I understand that, sir. Sounded like a phone call. That's right, sir, said Varson. He is an excellent candidate. It's just a shame that he's... The bell rang and Colin felt like his head was going to split in two. He covered his ears until the ringing stopped. Having wolf hearing was awesome, but less so when anything loud or high-pitched sounded. Played havoc with his senses. You all right, Col? Said Jeremy. Yeah, just got a bit of a headache. While Colin's social status had improved over the last several months, partially because he had eaten the school's evil biology teacher and partially because he now had muscles, lustrous hair, and was dating the hot, weird girl in school, he still didn't have a ton of friends. Colin was aware it was his fault. He had trust issues, even more so now that he was a werewolf. Aside from Becca, Jeremy was the only person Colin completely trusted, mainly because Jeremy had been Colin's friend before his change. But Jeremy wasn't what he seemed either. He wasn't a norm. But Jeremy didn't know that. Becca only knew a little, but apparently Jeremy was such a dangerous something that he'd been magic to be completely oblivious, which explained a lot. Explained why Jeremy got along with absolutely everyone, and it explained why he and Colin were friends. Jeremy hadn't cared that Colin had been a loser. He tried telling Jeremy about his change into a werewolf, but Jeremy just laughed and accused Colin of watching too many late-night movies. It was weird, and Colin couldn't help but wonder just who or what Jeremy was. The next class was history, which Colin actually enjoyed. Every night he had dreams of werewolves from the past, so history had become interesting to him. Jeremy joined Colin and Becca for lunch, which allowed Colin to duck the subject of Seattle and all that had gone terribly wrong. Becca gave him a sharp dig in the side along with that look, the one that meant business. After school, I want to hear the whole story, she whispered. No ducking. Out. Cross my heart, Colin said while trying to think of a way to disappear after school. The bell rang to signal the end of lunch and Varson's voice crackled over the school PA system. Attention students of Elkwood. The next period of classes will be starting a little late. If everyone would please proceed to the school gymnasium, we'd like to introduce you to the new principal. The loudspeaker screeched, making Colin's ears tingle uncomfortably. I guess this is it, said Jeremy excitedly. Why are you so giddy about this? Asked Becca. Jeremy shrugged. Well, it's a bit of excitement. Not like anything interesting ever happens around Elkwood. Becca and Colin glanced at each other. Classic Jeremy. The trio made their way to the packed gymnasium. Elkwood School was the only one in town that catered to all grades, from kindergarten to grade 12. They even had preschool twice a week for a handful of younger children. Colin, Becca, and Jeremy were directed to take a seat on the floor. This came with its own set of challenges, as Colin had to stay away from certain students. Tori, Elkwood's resident smoking hot teenage girl, was actually a siren. She had the ability to drive people crazy by releasing pheromones. Sirens usually did this to lure victims so they could eat them. Tori did it to tease every teenage boy within an 8-mile radius. Her pheromones wreaked havoc on Colin's werewolf senses and had actually triggered his first ever transformation, a fact he wasn't proud of. Consequently, they were no longer allowed to be in class together, which Tori found amusing. She took every opportunity to tease Colin, much to the dismay and rage of Becca. Another problem was Nathaniel and Micah Cross, known throughout the school as the Goth Twins, so called due to their love of dark makeup, spiked hair, and black clothing, and their deathly pale skin. They were both vampires, and the smell of a werewolf made them physically ill. Their mother, Mrs. Cross, was an ancient vampire who hated werewolves thanks to a several hundred-year-old feud and had tried to pull the twins from school when it was discovered what Colin was. Mr. Emerson had convinced her otherwise, and the twins joined Tori on an alternate class schedule. Colin noted the twins were at the back of the gym, looking pale and miserable. He could smell Tori, who was sitting on the far side of the gym. She gave Colin a wave and flashed that teasing smile of hers. Colin's heart skipped a few beats until Becca stood in front of him and scowled hard at Tori. She quickly looked away. Elric Varson entered through the side doors, which opened automatically, and took his place at a podium that had been set up at the front. The buzz quieted down and Colin could smell the anticipation in the room. It smelled minty. He made a mental note to write that down in one of his notebooks. Hello, students, said Varson. I am Mr. Varson from the local school board, also commander of a local supernatural task force and protector of our fair town, also the world's greatest fidget. Proving Colin's thoughts, Varson started to tug on his tie nervously. As I'm sure you're all aware, we've been searching for a new principal to take the place of Mr. Bear, who passed away so suddenly last year. Head bitten off. Of course the Norms believed that story because they'd had a spell cast on them. The freaks knew better. And I'm sure everyone noticed the new doors, continued Varson, and that you're all wondering what that's all about. Get on with it, Gareth Dugan shouted from somewhere near the back. This was received with a round of sniggers from his small gang of thugs and some stern shushing from the teachers. Yes, well, said Varson, I should explain that our new principal has a particular condition that prevents him from touching things. He's rather sensitive to germs, you see. He's a germaphobe? Colin whispered to Becca, who shrugged. We've installed automatic doors all over the school so he won't have to touch anything, and we encourage you to not make any efforts to shake his hand or touch him, other than this one tiny detail. Tiny detail? Mr. Sampson is an excellent candidate for the role of principal and has a long history of working in various schools throughout the world. We've agreed to accommodate his sensitivity, and we'd like you to join us in welcoming him here today. Colin felt a subtle shift in the air, as if the pressure in the room had dropped ever so slightly. It was similar to the tingly feeling before a storm. The side doors to the gym swished open and a short, bald, broad-shouldered man, with a round, rosy face, small dark eyes, a neatly trimmed beard, and a friendly smile entered the gymnasium, stood next to Varson, and beamed happily at the students. I'd like to present to you your new school principal, Mr. Sampson, said Varson proudly. The students applauded, and a few of the more enthusiastic ones cheered. Colin's muscles had tensed and he momentarily forgot to breathe. Colin, whispered Becca, what's the matter? A mild panic washed over Colin as he flashed back to the previous night, when his wolf senses had been blinded. As he sat and studied Mr. Sampson, he felt a similar sensation. Colin, said Becca more urgently, what is it? Colin turned to look at Becca and could see the concern painted across her face. It's Mr. Sampson, whispered Colin. What about him? I can't smell him. He has absolutely no scent. What? That's impossible. There's more. I can't hear a heartbeat either. Our new principal has no heartbeat. Chapter 4. Lone Wolf. Colin. Hi, Silas. What's up? Meet me at the forest. On my way. The final bell had just rung to signal the end of the school day. After the Initial introduction at the gymnasium classes had resumed as normal, but Colin had even more trouble than usual concentrating on his classwork. What kind of person has no scent and no heartbeat? Becca had said she'd try and find out more info from her dad about Mr. Sampson, but it did little to ease Colin's mind. Since becoming a werewolf, Colin was aware of everything. Hyper-aware. Thanks to his superhuman senses. To not be able to sense someone felt disturbing. On the bright side, a meeting with Silas probably meant training, which meant he could duck Becca for another few hours and avoid telling her about Seattle. "You're making it up," said Becca. "You're just trying to avoid telling me what happened last night." Colin could tell her feelings were hurt. He could smell it. That's the last thing he had wanted to do. He just didn't want to recount the embarrassing affair, especially not to a person he cared so much about. "I'm sorry, Becca, but I promise Silas really did call out to me, and I'll tell you everything. As soon as I'm done training, I'll call you and we can meet up for coffee." He threw in a pleading smile in his best effort at puppy dog eyes. "You look ridiculous," said Becca, but Colin could sense a slight crack in her icy demeanor. "Fine. But if I don't hear from you, I'm going to put such a hex on you that you'll regret it for the rest of your life." "You can do that," said Colin. "Try not calling me and you'll find out," said Becca. She kissed him lightly on the cheek, smiled playfully, and turned and headed in the general direction of her house. Colin turned and broke into a light jog away from the school. The weather was overcast and it looked like a fog would be settling in on the town overnight. Colin headed around the edge of downtown and jumped the low stone wall into one of the many farm fields that circled Elkwood's township. The forest sat at the far edge of the field, looking ominous. From there the wooded area stretched north for miles. It was a perfect place for werewolves as it provided cover and game for hunting. Colin had developed a taste for deer. He couldn't help himself. In his werewolf form it felt so normal, the meat practically melted in his mouth. Only when he turned back to his human form did he become completely grossed out. He reached the edge of the forest and sniffed the air. Only a faint scent of Silas. Colin entered the forest and listened, casting his hearing as wide as possible, which at his best guess was around half a mile when he was in his human form. Insects, birds, the rustle of trees, a stream, nothing out of the ordinary. No other people as far as he could hear. He quickly stripped down and stashed his clothes in his backpack and hung it on a tree branch. Colin thought wolfy thoughts and felt the change ripple through his body. It was still a slightly painful sensation. The first time he changed, it felt like he was rolling around in broken glass. Now it just felt like a bad sunburn. The transformation was so much quicker now, he could practically explode into his wolf form within seconds. Despite the pain, Colin enjoyed the sensation. The power surging through his body, the strength in his muscles increasing, his senses becoming so sharp that he could hear for miles, and could practically see scents in the air. Colin's arms, legs, and muscles expanded, his head changed shape and his teeth grew. The ground sank away from him as his body stretched and his powerful legs grew longer. Hair sprouted all over him, thick and coarse, covering his entire body. The transformation finished with claws sprouting from the tips of his massive wolf fingers. Colin stretched into his new form. The forest sprang to life, scents wafting in on the gentle breeze. He could smell Silas now, also in his wolf form. Colin dropped to all fours and took off at a run through the forest, pounding the ground and propelling himself forward and through the trees. The world became a blurred rush as he easily covered 2 miles and skidded to a stop by the small stream that had become their usual meeting place. Silas said it was because of the distance from the town and that there was a stream for drinking, but Colin knew he'd really chosen this place because it was the location of Colin's first change. Werewolf sentimentality. Took your time. The old wolf stalked out of the tree line on the other side of the trees. Not true. I know how much you like your alone time, wanted to give you an extra few minutes. Silas barked a laugh. The two massive creatures stalked each other in a wide circle. Colin was always on alert when they were both in wolf form. Silas had a habit of turning everything into a lesson. So why the last-minute training session? Not a training session. I have some news. I can tell from your tone that it's not good news. It's not great. The butcher is long gone, no trace of him. Do you think these other wolves got him? Maybe. Either way, that lead is dead. That is bad news. That's not the bad news. Colin felt a sinking feeling deep in his gut and his ears drooped a little. He stopped stalking and sat on his haunches. The scent of a distant deer tickled his nose, but now was no time for food. We've got a new lead. A confirmed kill by a werewolf. But that's good. It's in Europe. Oh. I'm leaving with Beta Team tonight. I'm guessing we'll be gone a week. Maybe. More, depending on how long it takes to track the group. You think it's a pack? I do. They left obvious clues. It was a bit of a mess. Other than him not being allowed to go along, Colin couldn't figure out the bad news. And then it hit him. The full moon starts in 3 days. I know. You're going to have to go it on your own. Colin whimpered a little. If a werewolf had enough control, they could change whenever they wanted. But the 3 days during a full moon, they can't control the change. Once the sun goes down and the moon rises, they change regardless every night for the 3 days. Since Colin's transformation, he and Silas had headed deep into the northern forested areas and camped for those 3 days. The full moon change was erratic. For Silas it was a walk in the park, but for Colin, being a new werewolf, it was a struggle. His inner wolf was never stronger than it was during a full moon. I talked to Var's son. He wanted to lock you up, but I convinced him to give you the option. You can spend the nights locked up in a cell at the base, or you can head out camping by yourself. But what if I can't control it? You've always been with me. Silas stood on 2 legs, walked over to Colin, and placed a large, hairy, clawed hand on his head. Colin, you have so much more control than I had when I was first turned. You choose to camp, I think you'll be fine. Keep to the forest. You can do it. I have faith in you. I don't know. A couple of days ago Colin would have been fine with the arrangement. Since the Seattle incident, he wasn't quite as confident. Think about it. I have to go. I've got rogue werewolves to catch. There was a sparkle in Silas's eyes during that last thought. Keeping the order and hunting bad werewolves had been his entire mission for the last couple 100 years. It's what made him happy. Colin had suggested Silas get a hobby, but the old man just laughed and replied that he already had one. Be careful, Silas. Always. The 2 wolves touched noses. 2 humans doing that would seem weird, but as werewolves it felt right, like a handshake or a hearty hug. Silas turned and raced off into the forest. Colin felt a pang of sadness as he watched his mentor disappear into the dark trees. He had hoped to ask Silas about Principal Sampson and if there was any reason why he wouldn't able to smell him or hear a heartbeat, but something had held him back. Silas didn't believe him about the floating man in Seattle, and that made Colin think his claims that the new school principal had no scent and no heartbeat would be dismissed just as quickly. I'm not going crazy. He'd just have to figure out that mystery by himself. Colin's stomach grumbled and the smell of deer came back to him again. His ears perked up and he stretched his muscles before launching off into the forest to follow the scent. He had only one thought in his mind. Dinner time. 2 hours later, the fog had settled comfortably over the town, darkness was beginning to fall, and rain floated down in a fine mist as Colin entered Elkwood's only coffee shop. Becca was already at the coffee bar ordering a drink for herself and a hot chocolate for Colin. She turned and waved. She looked beautiful. Her hair was tied back, and she wore a woolen sweater, fingerless gloves, a skirt and tights. All black naturally. The smell of freshly ground coffee beans gave Colin a bit of a headache. 3 girls from school, all a little younger than Colin, congregated at a table in the corner. They took turns looking over at Colin and then would talk quickly, then laugh in that weird way girls do. Girls confused Colin. Even having an actual girlfriend didn't help very much in that respect. They were still beyond any sort of reason or logic. Given the choice between hunting dangerous, murdering werewolves and figuring out girls, Colin would choose the werewolves. Far less scary. He casually listened to the girls' conversation while Becca waited by the coffee bar for their drinks. Oh my God. That's Colin Strauss, said one. He's so hot, said another. I don't see it, said the third. Oh please, Patricia. Like you don't see it. That hair. And that body. He works out. He has to. Their tones quickly shifted to disgust. I can't believe he's dating that Emerson girl. What does he see in her? I guess he likes that pale, sickly look. Eavesdropping, Becca said as she handed him his hot chocolate. She stood in front of him, smiling. What? Me? Innocent little me? Of course not, said Colin. They're making fun of me, aren't they? What hat? Said Colin with as little sincerity as possible. They're just jealous, Becca said and shrugged. She glanced over at the 3 girls who were hiding their giggling faces behind coffee cups. Colin watched as Becca placed the tip of her finger in her own coffee and whispered a few words, though he had no idea what she said. Sounded like a different language, maybe Latin. Colin felt a slight shift in the air. One of the girls at the table let out a scream and dropped her coffee on the table, spilling it. The other 2 looked shocked and then did the same thing. All 3 jumped away from the table. That coffee is burning hot, shrieked one of the girls. Becca licked the coffee from her finger, took Colin's hand and led him out of the coffee shop, a devious little sparkle in her eyes. You did that, said Colin. It wasn't a question. He'd seen Becca work magic before. She'd brought him back to life once. She'd made some objects float. And one time she'd created a glowing ball of fire. Colin's grandmother was training Becca, though he rarely saw them together, so he wasn't entirely sure how they were doing it. It seemed Becca's magic continually got stronger and stronger. The only bit of information Colin had managed to get out of his grandmother was that each witch's powers differed slightly. While his grandmother used the elements, Becca's power was firmly rooted in her ability to touch things. Tactile magic, she called it. They headed down the block, around a corner, and into a dark alleyway. Colin unlocked the back door to his grandfather's old automotive garage. Smelled of old cigarettes, motor oil, and dust. Colin's hearing also picked up a rodent living somewhere in the walls. This is where Colin and Becca came to be alone when they wanted to talk away from anyone who might want to listen in. They sat down together on the comfy couch at the back of the workshop. Colin wanted to kiss her. He always did. He couldn't think of a time that he didn't want to kiss her. He was sure there would come a time when he didn't want to kiss her, but that time had not yet occurred. So Seattle, said Becca. Spill. We're just going to get right to the point then? Colin said, keenly aware that kissing wasn't on the immediate agenda. Becca pursed her lips and waited patiently. Okay, said Colin. He recounted the whole story from start to finish. Their arrival in Seattle, tracking the butcher, Silas getting wounded, Colin's pursuit, the floating man, the change, no one believing him, the whole sordid affair. He finished with, and now I'm grounded from night watch until Silas can convince them I'm safe to go into the outside world. Becca studied her coffee thoughtfully. She doesn't believe me. I do believe you. And try not to think so loud, said Becca. Sorry. Colin's werewolf abilities allowed him to project his thoughts into certain people's mind. Some people were more receptive than others. Becca, being a witch, picked his thoughts up easily unless he kept them guarded. Wasn't difficult to do. Silas had taught him how. He just got lazy sometimes. He was a teenager after all. When you lost control of your senses in Seattle, was the sensation similar to when you saw Principal Sampson today? Colin thought about it. It wasn't exactly the same, but there were some similarities. In Seattle, it felt like the floating man was blocking my senses. Like I'd been cut off. With Principal Sampson, it was as if I couldn't sense him at all. Like he wasn't even there. Becca wrinkled up her nose. Colin had noticed it was a habit of hers when she wasn't happy with something. It's not exactly the same, but you have to admit they are similar, said Becca. You think the two are related? What did the floating man look like? He was young, maybe in his mid-20s. Ruggedly handsome, if you like that sort of thing. Colin smiled. Oh, you know me. I prefer the tall, hairy types. He definitely didn't look anything like Principal Sampson. I meant to ask Silas about it, but he's gone out of town. I know my dad shipped out too. I heard they took most of the soldiers. As a big mission. Colin felt a stab of regret. He should be going with them. Things had happened differently in Seattle. He could have been off to Europe to hunt evil werewolves too. Then I guess it's up to you and me, said Becca. What? What is? We need to figure out what the deal is with Principal Sampson. They left the garage and Colin walked Becca to the eastern edge of downtown. Becca lived in a stately farmhouse on the outskirts. Colin felt even more regret that tonight had featured no further kissing. I can still hear your thoughts, said Becca. Ah man, I really need to keep control of that, said Colin, his face flushing with embarrassment. It's okay. I like kissing you too. I was thinking. Becca's scent had shifted. She smelled nervous all of a sudden. Oh man, this is it. She's going to break up with me. I knew it, stupid. Stupid. I heard, said Becca, that you're going to be doing your monthly camping trip solo. Oh that. Oh man, yes, that I'm doing. Colin breathed a sigh of relief. Becca gave him a weird look. Okay, well, I was thinking if you wanted some company, I could probably camp out there with you. Separate tents, obviously. And we could even bring Jeremy. 100 thoughts raced through Colin's mind. First, camp out together. Nighttime. Alone, sort of. What about his nightly werewolf transformations? What if he couldn't keep control? He wasn't even sure he was going to go camping alone. He still considered just getting locked up at the base. But now with Becca's suggestion? Becca seemed to sense Colin's confusion. You don't have to decide now, said Becca. Just think about it, okay? Colin nodded while his head spun. Becca stood on her tiptoes and kissed him on the lips, then turned and walked away. Colin listened to her footsteps disappear into the quiet of the night. How would that even work? Jeremy would see me turn into a werewolf. What happens if I eat Jeremy? What happens if I eat Becca? Colin headed back through downtown and took the main road out of Elkwood toward his house. It was after 9 o'clock and the road was deserted. His werewolf senses wandered, almost on their own, while Colin was caught up in his own thoughts. He caught smells on the gentle breeze and the occasional snippet of conversation from somewhere nearby. And then Colin felt it. It was like a creeping sensation that ran through his whole body. Something didn't smell right, and the sounds of the night kept fading in and out like someone was turning the volume up and down. He started to panic and his heart rate increased. Oh no, not again. He felt the atmosphere shift the same way it did before it rained. The air felt heavy and Colin's whole body began to tingle. The fog was dense with only the occasional streetlight shining through here and there. But Colin didn't need the light. He could see just fine at night. There was nothing unusual around. His head swam and he began to reach for the wolf inside. Colin's senses snapped back and he could instantly hear normally again. What is wrong with me? Frustrated, Colin turned to continue home, resolving to write down everything that had happened, and almost ran straight into Principal Sampson. Oh my, said Principal Sampson. Oh, hi. Colin was at a loss for words. The jolly little man beamed at him. Mr. Strauss, isn't it? Yeah, said Colin. He couldn't smell the man at all, and he hadn't heard him approach. How is that even possible? He looked exactly as he had earlier at the school when Varsun introduced him. Same suit, same red cheeks, same bald head. Oh good, excellent, said Principal Sampson, slowly edging his way around Colin as if he was deathly afraid of being touched. I was just out for a nighttime walk, getting the lay of the land. He chuckled. I look forward to seeing more of you at school. Have a good night, young sir. Colin watched as the new school principal walked back toward town and disappeared into the fog. Fear crawled down Colin's spine. This can't all be a coincidence. First Seattle, then the new principal shows up, then tonight's weird events. And he's here again. No heartbeat. And the man gave off no scent. Most disturbingly, his footsteps made absolutely no sound. It was as if he weren't there at all. Principal Sampson wasn't human, and he wasn't the same as any of the other freaks in Elkwood, which raised one very disturbing question. Who or what is Principal